There we go. Welcome back. Here we go with the another lecture. Surprise, surprise. This one follows in many ways very naturally upon the last one. The last one dealing with the Augustinian Renaissance, and I concluded that lecture with a discussion of this ideal of the Augustinian hermits, the religious order that was the Augustinian hermits, of following in the footsteps of Augustine. That not only entailed, in a theological sense, but very much in that religious sense, the Religio Augustini, the religion of Augustine became their ideal. And I talked about that a bit, I think, um, because this is puts it in the broader context in many ways. All of the Mendicant orders, meaning the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians, were directed to pastoral care, to preaching and teaching, especially in the cities. That was their focus. And when Pope Alexander IV established the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, he did so explicitly, um, to direct them into the cities to preach and to teach to the people. Now, this traditionally had been considered to be the active life, pastoral care, preaching, teaching, listening to confessions, and all those aspects. But for the Augustinians, sorry, I'm getting myself caught up here a little bit. For the monastic life was the contemplative life, the vita contemplativa, which was withdrawal from the world and contemplating God. Now, one of the interesting things that Jordan, my Jordan of Quedlinburg, whom I mentioned, did was he redefined the contemplative life. For Jordan, the distinction between the active life and the contemplative life was not so much one of pastoral care, working in society with people, as opposed to withdrawal and contemplation alone in the wilderness, but rather this idea that anything that pertained to the soul was part of the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life. And that included, he argued, teaching and preaching and ministering to the people, because that was really caring for souls, the cura animarum, the attempt to care for souls. And that was a radical redefinition of the contemplative life for Jordan. Active life was taking care of the body. Now, that distinction between the body and the soul, of course, has been there even preceding Christianity, going back to Greek philosophy and things. But what Jordan did with it was new and distinct. And even though the Franciscans and the Dominicans also were very much involved in preaching and teaching to the people, the Augustinians redefined the very concept of their life along those lines. Also, they had something that the Franciscans and Dominicans didn't have. Their founder, footnote, that is, their mythical founder that they created to be their founder, Augustine of Hippo, was a bishop. That was something unique for the Augustinians. The Franciscans had St. Francis as their founder, one of the all-time great holy men, spiritual men, saints. And Dominic, the Dominicans, was a warrior, a soldier at first, a knight, but he became then a soldier for God, so to speak. And it's kind of funny because the Dominicans, even before the Jesuits, we'll get to the Jesuits in the 16th century when we get to the Catholic Reformation, but in some ways the Dominicans had some of the same characteristics as would be attributed to the Jesuits later on, but we'll come back to that too. But in some ways, the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola, whom again we'll be talking about later, you'll be reading his spiritual exercise, was fairly similar to Dominic. I mean, those kind of approaches, in terms of a noble background. They're both, warriors, had a religious conversion, and then attracted followers. And their whole point was to become a warrior for God, a warrior for the church. The Dominicans in Latin is the Dominicani. Um, that's the Latin for Dominicans, Dominicani. And it's a play on words, or it became a play on words. They became called the Hounds of God, because it's the canis, canis is dog in Latin, canis canis, and Domini is dog, is the Lord. So it's like the Domini Canes, or the dogs of the Lord. That's just a fun little pun, but it was known at the time. It was used at the time as a critique against the Dominicans, but they were a very active order, a very learned order. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, and on we could go about all of that. Well, my point of all of this is that the Augustinians look back to their founder as their rule and exemplar, as being a bishop who was also a hermit. Supposedly, Augustine had established a monastery, first of all, when he went back to Hippo. And then when he was, well, before he went to Hippo, we're back to Africa, in his home, Tagasta. And then when he became ordained a priest, part of the conditions for him agreeing to be so was that he could still continue to live with his monks, which the hermits turned into as hermits. Um, was his kind of first monastic foundation. And then when he became bishop, when he was ordained a bishop, not only did he then go and still visit and stay with his hermits, he also then established a monastery inside the episcopal compound for his priests, the priests of the diocese of the bishopric of Hippo. And so there were two monastic communities that he was in charge of. He continued to live the life of a monk, of a monastic, both with his hermits and with his canons. And for the hermits, this was the origin of the Augustinian canons, was that monastery that he established, that Augustine established within the episcopal compound after becoming ordained in 395. But the point here is that, again, we're talking more about the myth of Augustine and how that was used by the Augustinians more than the actual historical development of Augustine. Augustine did live as a monk, that we know. It is, in my view, extremely likely that the so-called Rule of St. Augustine is indeed authentic, that he wrote that rule. We know he has a couple of sermons where he is addressing his monastics, his monks. They were these two sermons numbers 355 and 356 were part of that collection, the sermons to his brothers in the Hermitage. They were the two authentic sermons. So we know that he did have this monastic life. It was described by someone who lived with him, Pisidius, who wrote the first biography of Augustine. So that is historical. But whether or not he then had these two very distinct foundations, the hermits, and then later, only after becoming bishop, the canons, is more questionable, let me say, in those terms. But for the Augustinians, that gave them their whole way of life, that religion of Augustine, which is in general sense a way of life and how you live your life, your Christian life, religio as that which binds you to God, um, a distinct and unique character and nature. And Jordan went on to define it as not simply the vita activa or the vita contemplativa, and not simply as the perfect life, the vita perfecta, because that was the vita perfecta was the life of the apostles. Everybody would agree with that. They lived the perfect life. Those original apostles around Jesus, and after his resurrection, that original apostolic community, that was the basis for the Augustinian rule, Acts 4:32. But Jordan said, contemplative life is not simply the perfect life. But when we combine the two, when we combine the active and the contemplative, we get the most perfect life, the vita perfectissima. And that was unique to the Augustinians. And that itself, as being a bishop, entailed pastoring and ministering to the people at large, hearing confessions, teaching, preaching, the care of souls. That was fundamental to the Augustinian mentality, identity, way of life. Not that the Dominicans and Franciscans were not interested in that. They were, and were very intently. But the kind of ideas behind it were different. And it wasn't so much that primary factor of identification for the Dominicans and Franciscans. I mean, for the Franciscans, it was more the spirituality, spiritual life and poverty. For the Dominicans, it was more teaching and learning, doing theology. For the Augustinians, it was all those combined, put in the service of love. That was also one of basis of Augustine's theology that was taken over by the Augustinians, namely a theology of love, and that included love for everybody. And the Augustinian theologians from Giles of Rome on even defined theology not as speculative knowledge, which was basically the Dominican tradition, that theology is this academic speculative knowledge, nor, as the Franciscans did, as practical knowledge. How do we go out and actually live? That was kind of the Franciscan approach. But rather as the term they use is affective, affectus, scientia affectiva. And the effects are difficult to translate. It's not just emotions. But for the Augustinians, that was love. It was a theology of love that was the very foundation of their theological endeavor, their mission, their ideology of who they were and what they were about. Put in the service of this pastoral mission, and walking in the footsteps of their leader, teacher, father, and head, St. Augustine, who was a bishop, whose the order was to embody. That is a lot of background. This is just the introduction. And to understand the Augustinian pastoral mission, we need first to put that in the broader perspective, not simply with the Dominicans and the Franciscans, but the new pastoral endeavor beginning in what's called the 12th century. The 12th century is one of those things that is not simply from January 1st, 1100 to December 31st, 1199. It's called the long 12th century, before January, a little bit after. It's a qualitative understanding that of developments that primarily took place within the 1100s. Anyway, this has been seen as a major development. So here we then start and go back to the pastoral theology and the pastoral endeavor of the 12th century Renaissance and Reformation. I'm now on slide 2, which is the first slide after the introduction, and I hope I can get through this without messing up and interrupting the lecture by stoppage and having to have another part 2 and 3 and 4 and God forbid 5 or 6. Anyway, so this pastoral endeavor. Now, if you've read chapter 1, or the introduction of chapter 1 of my Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, you will have seen that I discuss Giles Constable's concept that the 12th century was not just a Renaissance. I mean, the concept of the 12th century Renaissance goes back to the early 1924, I think it was, where Charles Homer Haskins published his great book, The Renaissance of the 12th Century. I could talk about that a lot, but that's another issue. But Constable came out and said, it really was a reformation of the 12th century that was so important, because what he said there was this was a real watershed in living the Christian life, in how the Christian life was conceived and perceived. And what is going on there was what I call, or have called, a secondary Christianization process. Now, the first entry on this slide is the Christianization process and religionization. Christianization is certainly not my term. Religionization is my term. But what I'm getting at is this. Christianization is, in general, how does Europe become Christian? How do we Christianize people? How do we make people Christians? And for the early period, from the missionary activities in Rome to the conversion of Rome, to then the Germanic tribes, and how do we Christianize the German tribes, which was a missionary activity, as well as simply under Charlemagne and things, as the people whom you're living around, the borders, you seek to extend. If you conquer some of those people, then how do you make them Christian? For the Franks, and all through most of the early Middle Ages, being a Christian simply meant you attended Christian Mass, you were baptized. So you were baptized, confirmed, and you attended Mass. That was it. It wasn't about beliefs. It wasn't about theological perspectives. It wasn't certainly about morality. There certainly were moral ideas, um, and all those things. I mean, they weren't against morality, but when we look at the sources, I think I may have mentioned this before, Gregory of Tours, these Franks were kind of bloodthirsty Franks, even though they were Christians. They were killing each other, families were killing, members of their families, and on it went. And these were good Christian family values for the Franks. Now, Gregory of Tours was a bishop, didn't praise such these vile deeds, but he didn't necessarily condemn them either, because what was most important at this time was simply that they are Christians, they're following Rome, they're not Arians or heretics, they are Orthodox Roman Christians, and isn't this great? So that's the first Christianization process. And in a classic article published for me back a little bit, but for you all the way back in 1986, I think it was, or 84, 86, John Van Engen. Who was he's still, I don't think he's dead yet, but he was at Notre Dame, even though he was not Catholic in any way, shape, or form, and rather anti-Catholic, but he had a position at Notre Dame. Very well respected medievalist internationally. And he wrote a major article called The Religionization or Christianization of the Latin Christian West, or something. I forget exactly what the title is, but the point was the Christianization process, as he described it, by approximately the year 1000, was complete, except for the Jews. Obviously, along the way outside fringes, there were still non-Christians within Christendom, but by and large, that Christianization had come to an end. And then what I come along and say is that what was needed thereafter was a secondary Christianization process, which I refer to as religionization. Now, that is kind of a complex issue. I talk a bit more about it in the introduction to Jordan's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. And in many ways, this lecture in general is just trying to help you and set the stage for reading the introduction and then reading Jordan's treatise, which again is the assigned reading for this week, and is the subject of your first text analysis. But it's I mean two things by it. First of all, we have to understand what the concept of religion was at the time. It was not the same as Christianity. I mean, Christianity was not a religion. It was seen as a faith, a belief, and actually as true faith and belief. Religion was how you fulfilled your obligations to God and to the church, etc. Cicero had defined religion as that which binds us to God, and it's our obligations, it's paying what we owe. And what do we owe? We owe things to, for Cicero, the state, our parents, and the gods. The gods, the state, and our parents in some form of order. And in the Christian view of that, it was very similar in that religion is that which binds us to God and to each other. And you could fulfill that in different ways. It's almost like different types of devotion. And in some ways, the term religion was very, in the Middle Ages, from the High and later Middle Ages, was very close to our sense today of devotion. You have a special devotion, a special mission that you focus on. That could be your religion in the medieval sense. And so on one of this attempt to say, okay, now that everybody's Christian, how do we make them Christian? I mean, it's fine that they're baptized and that they're going to Mass, but far more is needed to live a Christian life. That is this new endeavor that I call the religionization process, or the secondary Christianization process. Is, now that everybody's Christian, how do we make them Christian? In a more internal rather than an external sense. And it was a difficult process because you have to change centuries old beliefs, practices, ideas, assumptions. It's not just getting someone to conform, it is really transforming hearts and souls and minds. And that could be really hard. And at the same time, in the 11th and going into the 12th century, we have what's up there called the new monasticism, and I mentioned this briefly before. The Cistercians, the Premonstratensians, and the Carthusians. These were new groups, reform movements, first from Cluny, with Benedictine monastic reform itself, and they were all directly under the Pope. So they were outside of episcopal jurisdiction, and they decided all to live according to a monastic rule, to really live a dedicated, thoroughly dedicated life, and to minister to the people. Now, this was before the Franciscans, the Dominicans came about. These are still technically monks or Benedictine monks, but having become very kind of far away from what the original Benedictine tradition had been. But their goal was, again, to preach and teach to the people. Now, that whole approach, first of all, the general pastoral endeavor, we have an outpouring in the production of pastoral literature, preaching aids, preaching handbooks, confessors' manuals. These begin really being produced in large quantities in the 12th century, and they just continue. In the 4th century, there's another upsurge, and the whole point was to train people to train people, train members of their order to help teach and preach and minister to the people at large in society. What do we do? How do we handle such situations? How do we handle conflicts? How do we handle confessions? This became a real issue and a real problem and challenge. How do you do that? How do you transform people's lives? It's still a challenge for religious traditions today of all times. How do you really transform people's lives and do it in a genuine, sincere sense that also has um, a degree of theoretical, speculative, academic, theological perspective? And it's difficult. It's difficult and hard. How do we live? I mean, that's something we've never really been able to figure out. What is right and wrong? How do we always do what's right and wrong? Even if we leave out the sin aspect, how do we live the lives that we live, and on what basis and what reasoning and why? And do we follow our own principles and ideals? Now, I'm not going to go into all those questions here and now and tell you how to live your lives, because that's not, my place, number one, and I wouldn't even ever presume to begin to say I know how everyone should live. I mean, if I had that power and authority, it'd be kind of easy, but I would never even want to do it. Now, I'm getting way away from the point here, so my apologies for that. Just forget the last, 30 seconds to, 2 minutes of what I was saying. But the point here is that it was a challenge. How to transform people. And the Augustinians were very much involved in that and preaching to the people, going out, not only establishing churches in cities, that then, as I think I mentioned briefly before, came into competition with the parish clergy. And I'll come back to that probably again. I think I mentioned that in terms of anti-clericalism and the medieval crisis and the tension between especially with the new mendicants and then the parish clergy, but I'll come back to that as well. But it was a pastoral missionary activity in some ways, if that means anything to people out there, and how to go about doing so. And the Augustinians were at the center and heart of that. Now, in that context, the big question was, in terms of how do we transform people, what do people need to know? And how do we teach them? Now, the term catechesis is a Greek term that was Latinized, and it simply means teaching or instruction. How do we teach? Now, I should have maybe even said at the beginning of all of this, there was no such thing as the catechism at this time. The catechism, we will see, was a new thing, a new genre of literature, a new approach, a new technique that developed in the 16th century. And Luther wrote the first one. And then the Catholics got on board as well, and there are other catechisms that were developed. But in the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as a catechism or the catechism. There was catechetical literature, because it is an issue, and it's a debate. And this was one of the debates that the scholastic theologians in the 14th centuries discussed and debated is what's the relationship between the faith of a simple believer and a great theologian? And is a great theologian, does a great theologian have a better faith than a simple believer? And the answer, more or less, there was nuances with the answer, but in general, it was like, no, the theologian does not have any greater faith, any more privileged position than does the simple believer. But the theologian is to defend the faith of the simple believer. So it's a different type of knowledge that the theologian has, but that simple belief they saw as the core of Christianity. The problem is, how do you instill that? And is there some level of that simple belief that is, let's say, allowable? Or if there are issues that are not actually right. If people have this beautiful, let's say, beautiful, simple belief, but it is wrong about something, how do you deal with that? How do you change it? And that was what was confronting Christianity and all the people involved in pastoral care. But that was something that was confronting the Augustinians too. And it was like, okay, well, what is the let's say, the minimum requirements that people need to know for salvation? What do you have to know about Christianity to be saved? And that is not so much a theological or soteriological question in that sense of theology as it was, even though it was that too. It was simply, if you're a Christian, what does that mean? And are there things that you should know? I mean, you should know that Christianity is not about worshiping Mary or the saints. They are venerated; they're not worshipped. But so, what was the basis? And the minimum basis consisted of 3 texts. Again, I think of 3 texts. 4 texts, sorry, 4 texts, which became also the foundation of the Catechism later on. But this is what was seen as the basic knowledge that every Christian should know. And those texts were, number 1, the Creed, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. In some ways, it doesn't matter which. Both were accepted. Both were the foundational statement of belief. So the Creed you needed to know. The 10 Commandments you needed to be able to know. The Lord's Prayer you needed to be able to know. And the Ave Maria you needed to be able to know. The Hail Mary. You needed to know how to say a Hail Mary. You needed to know and have memorized the Lord's Prayer. You needed to know the 10 Commandments. And you needed to know the Creed. And this was whether you were able to read or not. This are things that you should be taught. And even with the Augustinians, because not every member of the Augustinian order was a theologian, they had lay members too. And at times they said, for the lay members, instead of repeating all the Latin liturgy, they could just say the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, the Pater Noster. That served as their instruction and served as their liturgical understanding and practice. It served as penance. So if you go and confess a sin, you might be given a penance of saying so many, Lord Pater Nosters and so many Ave Marias. So that was essential for the people at large. But then how to teach them those things was another issue. And this question is, what is needed for salvation? What is required for salvation? What is required to know is what I'm referring to here. Was a major question, not only for the common people on the streets, in the pews, so to speak, but also at the universities and the theological training. What is needed for salvation? What is this is called technically soteriology, the theological doctrine of salvation? What is needed? And is there, an absolute standard? Is there, a degree? If you know more, is that okay? Or does it only simply if you know enough to get in the door, so to speak? Is that what the purpose and goal is? So those are all questions that were debated, that were put forward, that was struggled with. And it all came down to dealing what people believed. and what is, let's say, the theological oversight. No, good term that we hear a lot about today. The theological oversight of the belief of religion. Now, I think I mentioned, this is going on now to the next slide, religion, belief, and theology. I think I mentioned that this concept of religion and Augustine's religion, and what I refer to in the introduction to catechesis as micro-religions, these individualized devotions, not on a daily basis of daily devotion, but how you live your life, your devotion to something, your vow. And Jordan often says it's related to vows, how you vow to live your life. It doesn't have to be monastic vows. But the issue was religion, and the understanding of it was based on belief, and belief was not uniform. It's not that everybody in the Middle Ages believed the same thing. And the first entry there in this slide, religion, belief, and theology, is popular religion and official religion. That's a distinction that scholars have made in many different facets. Religious studies scholars have made that, theologians have made that, historians have made that, cultural historians have made that, because official religion is that which the institution teaches. Popular religion is that which actually people do. Now, that can be at odds. Number one. Number two, popular religion included a lot of, let's say, beliefs that were not sanctioned by official religion. I have up there ritual and practice, superstition and magic. Ritual is simply the repeated acts, because we're talking about religious acts, and Jordan also talked about the religious acts, what constitutes a religious act. But it's the ritual of repeated engagement in set structures that are required. I mean, that's kind of an abstract, inchoate definition. But if we think about it, the Mass is a ritual. Baptism is a ritual. All the sacraments are ritual. We all have our rituals, and they're part of society and part of life. They help give us meaning. It has been argued that sports for Americans are a ritual. If you go to a Colts game, it's like a ritualized experience. And leaving aside all those issues in terms of the relationship between sports and religion, I think you can probably get what I'm getting at here, at least to make the point. So there's the ritual that is established. And then it's like, were there other rituals, and how do we incorporate rituals that were part of, let's say, pagan beliefs before the conversion? I mean, one of the brilliance of Christianity in terms of conversion and missionary activity from early on was to accept what could be accepted and to interpret matters in a Christian way. It wasn't to expunge a belief completely. To say, okay, you worship, a tree. Well, let me tell you about the trees. The trees are a very important symbol, and actually, they symbolize Christ. The Christmas tree is a pagan symbol, but it becomes a Christian symbol as evergreen, everlasting, those aspects. And so, it is adopting to a culture and making Christian what's already there within the culture, and that is very. And it was brilliant insight. I mean, I can't say anybody came up with it, but who had that principle. It was never, decreed at the council that I'm aware of or anything. But that was the basic approach: was that what we will accept what we can and make it Christian. Saints have been talked about. They were just pagan heroes that then became Christianized, and so they were saints. And the issue of power, and I could talk a lot about that in the whole original Christianization process of the Germanic tribes and things. But the point here is that it was not simply that there is one way of doing it, and so you have to become Christian, you have to accept this and do this and don't think about it and just do what we say and tell you. That was never the case. It was always a negotiation and somehow making the life that you have into a Christian life and forming it, and not saying it's wrong and get rid of it, but shaping it and forming it within along keeping with Christian ideals and practices and principles. So that then is, we have to realize, for the religious life in general in Europe, ritual was central. And that was not simply the Mass, it was not simply confession, but it was a fundamental aspect of a religious life. And so those symbols and images are so important because ritual includes symbols and images. How do we understand them? What do we make of them? And a false or erroneous understanding could lead to superstition and or magic. And that is, I think, very understandable. Magic, I'm not going there's a whole history of magic and superstition, and what we believe, and I'm not going to give definitions here and there. It can be a very fine line between um, religious devotion and belief, Christian belief, and superstition and magic. Um, and superstition was shunned upon and tried to be, let's say, corrected. Magic in general was just condemned, and I'm not talking here about magic shows or things or marvels. There are people who do marvelous things, but the attempt to manipulate causation by means of usually diabolical help, satanic help, demonic help, um, was seen as at least a possibility. And then we don't have a lot of instances of the condemnation of magic early on, but it was there because of the beliefs of people, the popular beliefs of people. Now, this goes back to one of my fundamental principles that humans are, well, going to contradict myself because I was going to say that one of my fundamental principles is that humans have always been rational and that we always seek a reason for things. And we only appeal to divinity when we can't find a natural cause for things. That's a long. Um, there's a lot behind that statement. I would have to go into it, and you're welcome to ask me about it, and I will happily elaborate on it at much greater length. But I was saying I want to contradict myself because one of my other fundamental principles is that humans are actually basically irrational people. Uh, but that's so it's like rational, irrational. But we look for an understandable reason. And superstition and magic can offer that. And especially when all of a sudden people who are not, let's say, educated in Aristotle are told and taught that what happens within this ritual of the Mass, of the Eucharist, when the priest elevates the elements of the bread and the wine and speaks the words of institution with the bread, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, there is a transformation. And what had been bread all of a sudden was no longer bread, but was the actual physical body of Christ. And the same with the chalice and the blood. The wine became the actual physical blood of Christ. Whew. Wow. And if we then realize, as we're also taught, that Jesus was also God, all of a sudden God is present there on the altar in the elements. Now, the elements still look like bread and wine, taste like bread and wine, smell like bread and wine. And that was based on an Aristotelian distinction as formulated in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, been debated before that time, whereby Aristotle had analyzed all things, all beings that exist, into substance and accidents. Accidents are those things that can change, but don't affect who you are. I mean, like, I think this is the first time in this class that I'm doing a video with a jacket on. Before I've been wearing a vest. That's a change in accidents, even though it's still me. Now, I could come in here and just wear a t-shirt. That would still be a different, a change of accidents, not accents, accidents, accidents, without it being that'd still be me. I wouldn't be fundamentally different because the substance of me would stay the same. If all of a sudden I start eating a lot this semester, and so I start appearing like, boy, Professor Sack, you're gaining a lot of weight. Maybe you better cut down on things. You're sitting there at home doing videos. Gaining weight or losing weight, if I let my hair grow, I mean, I don't have much hair to grow, but I could kind of get disgusting, and sometimes I don't always get a haircut as soon as I need, or my beard too, it gets longer than I would sometimes like, and so, I'll have to apologize if I come on here like that, but I'll try not to, at least try not to let it get too bad in any case. But that would all be a change of accidents. But I'm still me. That's the substance. And Aristotle, we could analyze all things into those two categories. Is it a substance or is it an accident? And if it's a substance can't change because then the thing itself changes. Accidents change frequently, or can. Now, what the church argued, what the theologians of the Fourth Lateran Council argued, is to describe what happens in the mystery of the Eucharist. The mystery of the Eucharist, which is as great a mystery as the Incarnation, is that in this unique case alone, the accents remain the same. The substance changes. The substance is transformed, even though the accidents are the same. So the bread before the words of consecration are tastes like bread, looks like bread, is bread. After the words of consecration, Hocus Corpus Meum, it is then still the accents haven't changed. It still looks like bread, tastes like bread, etc. It looks like wine, tastes like wine. But the substance has changed, that which the thing actually is, and the thing with the bread after consecration is what it is actually is the physical body of Christ, and the wine is the physical blood of Christ under the accidents of wine and bread. Now, some of this is I want to go off on here too because it's going to be important in the debates of the 16th century when we get there, at least to some extent. But that's the official position is called transubstantiation, that the elements are transubstantiated. Now, that can be seen as miraculous, can be seen as a miracle. We do have stories of all kinds of things that people did with the host. We're supposed to be ingesting Jesus's body. Great. The people were not given the cup. They didn't trust people with the wine to spill it on themselves, and you don't want to spill Jesus's blood. I'll talk more about some of that later, I think. A great pastoral handbook, one of my Augustinians, Herman of Schildesche. I'll come back to that at another point in time because I didn't include it in this lecture. So it's just, they would, keep it. They wouldn't eat it. So they'd go up to receive communion and would receive the host, hold out their tongue. The priest would put it in their mouth. They go back to their seat, and then they would take it home and plant it in their garden, or give it to their horse. Listen, my horse is sick. This is a healing thing. This is something that will help. I'm going to go and give it to my horse. Or my crops need an extra boost. I'm going to go plant it in the ground. Those are types of superstitions that we're seen not as magic, but it was very kind of close to magic. But the church has said we have to make sure that we address those types of superstitions. Astrology was one. The whole issue of astrology and the relationship to astronomy in the Middle Ages on into the 16th century. They were more or less interchangeable, the words and what they referred to. Astrology or astronomy was seen as a mathematical issue and the influence of the planets, whereas the forecasting of fates and all those things was seen as superstition. Now, I'll come back to that when we get there because there's a distinction and kind of a conflict and debate between Philip Melanchthon, who advocated for astrology, and Luther, who debunked it and said, no, not at all. But that's just kind of setting that up when we get there. But so superstition was an aspect of, popular religion. How do we understand these things? If we walk under a ladder, is that bad luck? If a black cat crosses our path, is that bad luck? What are those aspects of our lives that we attribute superstitious beliefs to, even if we are absolutely convinced they are true? And it's based on accepting correlation is causation. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but that's one of the big basic principles is correlation is not causation. Just because things happen, in parallel doesn't mean one causes the other. But superstition is then accepting correlation as causation. So that, oh my gosh, every time I walk under a ladder, I end up, tripping and something. It doesn't mean that the ladder, and you're walking under the ladder, causes you to trip. The same thing with, again, going to the sports analogy, we have our superstitions. You always have to wear the same jersey, you always have to go through the same process. And if you don't, that's going to mean that you're going to lose and not perform as well, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all superstitious beliefs relating correlation and claiming it is causation. Now, that is one of the issues that was involved. And the attempt to then teach and inform the superstitious mind, not so much to condemn it. Some things could be condemned, but some things could very well just be educated. If we can educate people, we can help do away with superstition. Or so it was thought, so it is still sometimes assumed, even though I think that is increasingly questioned in this day and age, but that's another matter. So that's the whole point of what the catechetical endeavor was about. How do we reach minds and souls to distinguish belief, ritual from superstition and magic? And that is the endeavor. And you will see, in some ways, a very good example of the distinction between, let's say, official religion or learned religion and popular religion when you read Jordan's exposition on the Lord's Prayer. Because that last lecture, Jordan gave, or even after that last lecture, lecture 10 on the Amen, he gave another exposition, which is labeled the exposition on the tree of the virtues and vices, the Expositio Arboris. There he tries, as he says explicitly, to summarize the entire Lord's Prayer around the image of a tree. And you will see he uses birds, he uses beasts to try to visualize this entire prayer for the people who, let's say, needed a visualization rather than rationally reading through the lectures and think, okay, I can follow the argument here, the biblical passages here, and that's supported very well. Okay, all fine and dandy, but let's look at then this image. But he said, but that too is for everybody. Because that's one of the things with popular religion and official religion. We can't just say they're in conflict because the scholars, the theologians came from the popular strata. It wasn't that they just popped out as great theologians. They bring that all with them. And Jordan was trying to say, okay, at least let's try to put this all together. And there you'll see some of the couplets. Talk about some of the bird and animal lore, and the very strong focus on the virtues and vices. But that's also in his regular lectures. The virtues and vices were basically the answer to how do we live our life, meaning we should cultivate the virtues and avoid the vices. And there were, three theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Four cardinal virtues. Don't ask me what they are here. There's a diagram in the introduction where I go through them all and how they all relates. And these virtues and vices were correlated with the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the Beatitudes. And I talk about that in the introduction, again with the chart for you. So the idea was to integrate and bring all together these concepts of how we are to live and to live based on virtue, virtus. Virtus in Latin is power or strength. A virtue is that which gives us strength. And a vice gives us weakness. And a vice takes away from virtue. So the virtues and vices are in conflict. We have them all out there, we still are doing that. I often come in different contexts, but ask my students, how many of you knowingly and willingly and gladly do things that you know are not good for you? And then if someone doesn't raise their hand, I say, yeah, right, you're lying. I do constantly things I know are not good for me. everything from overeating, and I'm not going to go into all my vices right here and now, um, so I'm not going to do that. But I think you can, imagine, and you can imagine for yourselves what your vices are. Those things that do not contribute to a healthy, happy life necessarily. At least they do contribute maybe to a pleasurable life, depending on what we mean by happiness, and we can go from there. But the whole point then was to cultivate virtue and avoid vice. Then the issue is, what is a virtue? Is it a gift? Is it a gift from God that we're given? Is it an innate possibilities or skills or aptitudes that we're born with? Because we all have those. Some people have an aptitude for some things and others for others. But what is a virtue, or is it a habit? Is that something that we have cultivated as we get into the habit of doing something? Certainly, vices seem to be that way. Vices are probably not given to us, imposed upon us, but the demonic, the demons, the devil can try to get us to become habitual vice people. I know that doesn't really work out very well, that formulation, but I hope you know what I mean. In that it's an issue of habits. In some ways, it's like good habits or bad habits. And if we're filled with bad habits, how do we establish good habits? Or if we already have good habits, how can we make them even stronger and avoid the bad habits? And are those habits something that God gives us, or that we are left on our own to develop? So this whole concept of virtue and vices, and there were handbooks written on this. There were treatises written on this, the whole bit in terms of, and this became the answer to how to live a Christian life. To cultivate virtue, avoid the vice, because the vice is related to sin. Virtue is related to goodness and to power and strength as living a good Christian life. And that was the summation in some ways of Jordan's lectures on the Lord's Prayer, the function of the Lord's Prayer. Because every petition in the Lord's Prayer that Jordan discusses is an aid to virtues and an aid to excluding vices. That's when he says the inculcation of the virtues and the exclusion of the vices. You'll read about that. That's the whole point of saying that the Lord's Prayer is not simply a rational mental thing of bequesting or beseeching or requesting or asking. It's also a ritual act that has an effect on our very souls. That is kind of the point. The more we say the Lord's Prayer, Jordan in his lectures are explaining what that effect has on us. So, in terms of this work and how it fits in with the catechetical endeavor, it is very much Jordan's lectures a catechetical treatise. It's part of the catechesis, but it's not part of a catechism because there wasn't. It originated as I think I've said, as his lectures in the studium in the Augustinian school in Erfurt in 1327 when he was lecturing on Matthew. So he is teaching his students. He is lecturing on the Gospel of Matthew, and when he gets to Matthew 6, we find the Lord's Prayer. Now, he later incorporated the Lord's Prayer into his first major collection of sermons, the Opus Postularum, the sermons 289 to 298. So are these things, the text, I have it there, the problem of the text, lectures or sermons or both. Is it sermons or is it lectures? Or how do we put those together? How do we understand what this thing is, what we call the text of Jordan's exposition? And that's a problem. And it's a problem for historians in general, because so often what we do is we see, oh, nice, pretty book. And this is the book cover of it, isn't it? I know it all comes out backwards, but this is actually a 15th century broadsheet, which kind of schematizes the Lord's Prayer as such. And I argue that there's a lot of influence of Jordan's treatise on that broadsheet. But anyway, that's another issue. But we see this book, we see this thing. Here's the text of Jordan's exposition on the Lord's Prayer. It's not. This is my edition and translation. I'm not going to go into all the editorial problems, the philosophical problems of textual analysis and textual criticism. If you're interested, please let me know. I mean, I think I mentioned I'm writing this book on history, and that's a big part of it in terms of how can we know the past at all, and what are these things that we talk about and analyze. Um, but I want you to be aware of the problem and issue, especially, I mean, the translation. Um, what we read in translation, this will apply to all of the texts that have been assigned to all the text analysis. For the purposes of this course, you can accept the translation, but I want you to be aware that there could be problems with it. There are problems, even if you're doing a translator is trying his or her best to be as faithful to the text as possible. There are going to be issues and problems. Translation, something that's always lost. And then sometimes too, translators want to be literary. They want to, make things sound good, be pretty, and they change things, and that can also warp things. And also then in the concept of what we know is true, what we assumed is true, what I call the a priori meaning that we all bring to what we read, we see things differently. And so we'll translate something that, oh, I know what that is, and I'll translate it that way. Which maybe the author, the original creator of the text, had a very different meaning. So it's a very difficult process. But what I want you to strive to do and work with is say, okay, with these lectures, I think I already mentioned if you can read the Latin, great, but that's not expected or assigned or anything else. But the more, I don't want to put burdens on you. If you have never studied Latin at all, then just basically ignore the Latin, unless I may refer to phrases and things, and you can. There are Latin phrases I want you to know. Transubstantiation is a Latin phrase. Hocus corpus meum, I want you to know this is my body. There may be others. But for the purpose of this course, don't worry. If you've had some Latin, feel free to look at the Latin and think, oh, okay, you can ask questions. Is this translated? Why did I translate it this way? What's this really mean in getting at? If you have studied a lot of Latin, you can read the Latin. That's fine with me. Does that make sense? I mean, you can base your textual analysis on the Latin if you are able and would like. Please, that would be great. But what is expected and assigned for the course is just the English translation, my English translation. And what I want you to do is read that, try to make sense of it, put it together, and that's why also reading the introduction is important. And there you'll see also the charts of how it's all correlated, and then answer the question that's given you. And if you've looked at the text analysis question, you will see that I start with a quotation from Luther in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, meaning the now what question. Now that we're Christians, and for Jordan, I argue that it's very much based on God's predestination and grace. The question is now what? So what that we're predestined? We don't even know. We hope we might be. If we are, we are. If we're not, we're not. But that's all based on God's grace. But we're in this fight between the virtues and vices, or between God and the devil. This battle with it, because the devil is always there. The devil's always trying to snare us away. Ha ha! I got you. Even under the guise of goodness and things. So how do we handle that battle? That battle between God and the devil that we find ourselves caught in the midst of. The now what question, which is basically how do we live a Christian life? How do we do that? What are the Jordan's answers based on his lectures on Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer. Teach us to pray. This is how you should pray. Okay, the Pater Noster. And what does that all mean when we say those words? Think about that. Answer the question. The closer you can stick to the text, the better. The closer you can stick to the text, putting it in the broader context, even more better, i.e., referencing the introduction or bringing in information from the introduction, bringing in information from Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, introduction to chapter 1, to come to answer that question that's given you, because that is the basis for, or will be the basis for my grading and evaluating your text analysis, and for everyone, as also the final, is I give you the problem, right? I say, here's the problem. Here's the basis for you to answer it. And based on the course material, all that is assigned. You don't have to go out and do any research whatsoever. In some ways, I would say, please don't. but based on what is assigned and available to you, how do you apply the lectures, the other assigned readings to this problem? That's the issue in the question. That is what it's all about, and how well you do so is will be the basis for my grading your analyses. You know, I want you to do well. I mean, I do. I get excited when people actually do what I ask them to do. And when they kind of, that light bulb goes on, oh, I get it. That's important. Now, if you're struggling, let me know. Just send me an email and let's talk about it. We can go over things. I'm happy to meet with people on Zoom to talk about things. I'm happy, at least in abstract theoretical sense, to read drafts. If you want to send me a draft, um, I'm not going to write it for you or edit it for you, but I can give you a sense of, well, you're really kind of, you have some good things here, but then you kind of go off and you're losing the plot, so to speak. But we can talk about that too. So feel free to send me drafts or whatever, and I'll get to them to the best I possibly can, and as soon as I possibly can. But this is the whole point, because these texts that exist are the only means we have to say anything about the past. This is how we know about the past, because the past doesn't exist. We can't go back there. It's reading the sources, what is extant, the extant documents, and making them available. That's what this does. This makes Jordan's text available because it's written in Latin. There are Latin manuscripts in one printed edition, Latin printed edition. You can read about all that in the introduction as well. It makes it available for people to use, so I can actually assign it in this class. I couldn't simply make a copy of the Berlin manuscript and say, here you go, read it. I couldn't. I mean, theoretically I could, but that would be gross malpractice if I then failed you on it, because you can't be expected to read it. And no undergraduate can, because it takes a lot of paleography and experience, and I'm not going to go there. But it's to realize, how do we know what we know when we make statements? When we talk about the Reformation, what is that based on? And how do we interpret it and come to an understanding of what happened and what did it all mean and what it was the impact? And we'll be talking about those issues as we go through. Those types of questions are what's behind my On History, which I think I have already offered to, if anyone's interested, to send to the draft chapters. I think it's probably fairly near the last draft, and just have to kind of polish it up and finish the footnotes and stuff. But I'm not going to assign it, and you're not expected to know any of it except from what I talk about in the lectures, because it's so difficult. It's so difficult to say anything about the past. Think about that. I want you to ponder that. How can we say this is what Jordan thought? We can say this is maybe what I read in Sachs' translation. Ooh. What would Jordan say if Jordan were here? He's not. He's dead and gone. We are the only means that Jordan still has a voice, or Luther, or Calvin, or anybody else. They're dead. We historians, have to give them a voice. We represent them. And for me, that is an awesome responsibility. Now, I don't mean to be freaking you out as you're getting ready to work on your first text analysis. But I want you to have some sense of that. That's not simply, oh, I just read this and say, oh, here it is, it's easy. That's not what this is about. It's to struggle with it, to say, what did Jordan mean? What was he getting at? What was behind this? How was it used? Does that make sense? If not, please just email me and we'll talk more about it, because I want to have the sense that you are as prepared as possible for doing your first text analysis, and we'll go from there. Now, also don't ignore the Expositio Arboris, because that is an important piece in the whole puzzle. That is Jordan's own attempt to translate his official lectures in the sense of official religion to a popular audience, but one that also works for the learned audience. It's quite stunning. I think it's very important. And I was, I won't say shocked, but it's, I think it's like, wow. Uh, this is one of the earliest examples we have of it. This use of images and scenes. And I'll talk a little bit later. We'll talk about the Passion of Christ. That Jordan also wrote a very popular meditations on the Passion of Christ, and he was the first one really to break it up into individual scenes, that we're supposed to meditate on individual scenes like a PowerPoint presentation. But anyway, I can say more about that, but it's really a beginning of a shift in knowledge technology and how knowledge is presented to be taught, to be taught, to be reflected upon, to make effective. And we can talk a lot about that if you want. But I think it's kind of like, whoa, this is an amazing development. And there we go. And the whole point of all this, the whole point of Jordan's lectures was to transform lives and to save souls. They're transforming lives and the salvation of souls. That was the goal of the late medieval catechetical endeavor of the Augustinians, and in many ways of all the people involved from all the different religious orders, as well as the parish priests. How to go about doing so? What's required? What do people need to know? All those aspects point to the goal of what the catechetical endeavor was all about. Now, I have it there. I think I mentioned it before. The second point, and this is the last slide, transforming lives and the salvation of souls. Every Christian should be a saint. Jordan's transformational sanctity. Um, that too is, I think, an astounding statement for the time. Because even though scholars talked about the faith of the simple believer and the great theologian, the idea of being a saint was that you are not like everybody else. You're different. It's like we have our sports heroes. I know, going back to the sports analogies, but the sports heroes are different. Not everybody can be, a Patrick Mahomes. It's just, it's impossible. He's a saint in that sense. He's special. That's what sanctus means. It means separated out. That's what a holy means. It means separated, is set apart, set aside, because they're different. And that difference could be seen as in better than. Religion, in the legal sense, was joining a monastic order and taking vows in a monastic order. If you did that, you were said to be entering the state of religion, in statu religionis. So that had a higher legal status than being a layperson. And so it's an issue of, okay, what is really needed? It goes back to levels and degrees. St. Paul says, I wish everybody would be celibate like I am, but okay, it's better to marry than to burn, so it's okay. Go ahead, get married. Keep it kind of clean, so to speak. You can still be saved, but it'd be better if you were like me and be a celibate and be, kind of a radical, completely devoted to God, going around missionary. If you dropped everything and sold all that you had, gave it to the poor, and started following Christ, what do I have to be saved? You know, the rich young man asked Jesus, and he says, well, follow the commandments. He goes, I've done that all my life. He said, okay, well, then if you want to be perfect, sell what you have and come follow me. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. So that levels of perfection. And Jordan, you'll see, and I talk about this, I think, in there too, talks about the beginners in the religious life, those who are making progress, and those who are perfect. Now, perfect doesn't mean perfect, can't be better. It simply means they've achieved that level up to the highest degree. They are complete. So that is the perfecti. That's the perfecti. It's a progress. It is a journey. And for Jordan, it's part of the journey of returning back to God. From this state of alienation after the fall, we are no longer in communion with God. How do we re-achieve communion with God? Because that is what was intended. And that is what salvation is about. That is what the Christian life is about. And that for Jordan is what I refer to as transformational sanctity. Because for Jordan, it's not just the Patrick Mahomes. Everybody should be a saint. Everybody, he says, should be bright and shining as the stars. That's what living the Christian life means, is to be a saint, to be holy. You don't have to be a member of a religious order. You don't have to be a priest. Everybody can be a good Christian and a saint. And this is, in the early to mid 14th century, long before Luther's so-called priesthood of all believers. It's different, but there's a lot of similarities there. And it's part of what I call this Reformation of the later Middle Ages, because what Jordan in this catechetical endeavor is striving and endeavoring to do is to reform people's lives. So this transformational sanctity is there. It's not just say, oh, let's look at this person. This person is so holy because of their asceticism, because of their devotion, because of what they've done for the church. No, it is the whole point of sanctity is to transform people. That's what I was getting at. I talk about it, I think, in Lutheran Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And it's part of that reforming endeavor. It's part of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages to transform people's lives, which will make a difference in society at large. As we all make our way back to God, overcoming this alienation that we find ourselves in within this temporal realm where we can't really know what's going on or how to get back to our home. And in that sense, it's a very Augustinian approach and position. That was Augustine's issue, striving, awaiting, and hope to get back to that eighth day finally, an eighth day of rest when we will be at peace, when we will be home. And that Augustinian perspective, the Augustinians, in general, I'm not saying each and every one, but in general, adopted and accepted as their own and as the foundation of their catechetical mission, their pastoral endeavor based on a theology of love, teaching the people, reaching the people, pastoring to the people in order to win souls, to help people on the way, to serve as that guide, and to teach, to preach what they needed to know to return to God. That was the whole point of the endeavor, and that is what catechesis before the catechism consisted of. How to navigate and live your life as a good Christian life in the battle between God and the devil. Some of these themes we'll see again in a couple of weeks. We'll get to Luther because there are a lot of similarities, but also some differences. And we'll talk more about those when we get there. But for now, that's part of this whole Augustinian way of life that I talked about with the Augustinian Renaissance and following in the footsteps of Augustine, who was a bishop, a pastor, and a monk, all together, which the Augustinians sought to imitate in all their works, whether it is their political theology supporting John the 22nd or Boniface VIII and John the 22nd, in their academic theology at the universities, or in their pastoral endeavor, teaching and training in the schools, local schools in Erfurt, for example, which wasn't yet a university. It was a studium at Erfurt. Preachers to go out and preach and teach. So it was this it was providing the supply is what Jordan was doing, as well as doing it himself, of reaching the people as a mission, as their religion itself. Now, I'm going to leave it there for now. Continue next week. And again, if you have any questions, please just ask. And I think we should all give a sigh of relief and maybe a standing ovation that I didn't click off and have to start again this time. I think I may have devised or realized a way to avoid that. So we'll see next week with lecture 1 of next week whether that kind of sticks or not. But I'm glad I made it through this time. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend, and I look forward to reading your textual analyses. And we'll be back with week 4, lecture 1, in the near future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.